They went to bed alive. They woke up dying. Night after night, bell towers that had once marked market hours tolled instead for the city's dead. One morning, the baker did not open his shop. By evening, his neighbor's house was shuttered and silent. Within days, families disappeared from their streets, and the bodies left behind piled into hastily dug pits. What began as a whisper of fever and swelling lymph nodes became, in months, a calamity that remade Europe. Today we ask, what hidden forces, ecological, commercial, human, turned a bacterium in the steppes into the Black Death of the 1300s? In this film we will trace those mechanisms, weigh contested claims, and separate dramatic rumor from the best evidence historians can offer. I'm Tim, and this is an investigation into the dark secrets of the bubonic plague in the 1300s, how it began, how it spread, and how a society at its peak of connection met its most devastating test. If you want more deep dives into history's turning points, subscribe now. Before the disaster, Europe was not a backwater. The opening decades of the 14th century were the product of centuries of growth. Fields expanded, towns multiplied, long-distance trade routes hummed with caravans and ships. Gothic cathedrals rose across the continent. Markets and fairs buzzed. Universities and courts were active. The Pax Mongolica across Eurasia had reduced the risks of travel, and silk, spices, and ideas flowed between east and west along the Silk Road and by sea. That very connectivity, the arteries of a prosperous, densely populated world, would also become the plague's highway. Climate and ecology played a quieter, invisible role. For years, small mammals in the Eurasian steppe, different species of marmots and wild rodents, harbored Yersinia pestis, the bacterium modern science identifies as the primary cause of the medieval bubonic form of plague. Under normal conditions, these rodent populations and their flea parasites lived in a rough balance. But the early 14th century saw ecological stress. Cooler, wetter conditions in some regions, localized famines, and disruption in the grasslands. Modern scholars suggest those stresses pushed infected rodent populations toward trade routes and settlements, increasing contact with commensal rats that lived on ships and in towns. In short, ecological displacement can create the conditions for a pathogen to jump species, and what happened on the steppe set the stage for a spillover that, once it reached human networks, moved with terrifying speed. To understand how the disease leapt from a remote epidemic into a pan-European catastrophe, we must look at hinge moments, places where human behavior, trade, and narrative met the bacterium. One of those moments is the siege of Kaffa on the Black Sea, a fortified Genoese trading colony in Crimea. Contemporary chroniclers report that in 1346, the Mongol army besieging Kaffa, led by Khan Jani Beg of the Golden Horde, was itself struck by a swift and deadly disease. One later European account claims that, desperate and terrified, the besiegers catapulted the corpses of their dead into the city to infect the inhabitants. That image, corpses flung from mangonels over the walls, became a vivid story in later retellings. It's important to handle this claim carefully. The primary source for the corpse-flinging narrative comes from a Genoese notary, whose chronicle recounted the horrors at Kaffa. Accounts report the action. They do not provide the kind of forensic proof modern epidemiology requires. Modern historians debate whether that episode functioned as a literal biological attack that seeded the plague in European ports, or whether the story is better understood as a narrative of terror that circulated among contemporaries. Some scholars caution that even if corpses were hurled, the mechanics of Yersinia pestis transmission, flea bites carried by rats and ships, mean the siege may have been one contributory factor among many, rather than a single definitive cause. The Kaffa account, contested though it is, remains a striking reminder of how violence, rumor, and disease can intersect. From Crimea, the pathogen needed carriers, and maritime traffic provided them. Genoese galleys, laden with cloth, grain, and crews, returned westward. Ships were notorious micro-ecosystems. Sacks of grain, food stores, and timber provided harborage for black rats, Rattus rattus, and fleas moved between rodents and humans when contact was close. On board, a disease that incapacitated a handful of sailors could, through rats and fleas, spread to the crew and then to the port where the ship landed. Messina in Sicily is often cited as the first major European flashpoint. According to chronicles of the period, a Genoese ship arrived in Messina with its crew ill and dying. Within days, the disease spread among those who handled the cargo and among families in the cramped waterfront neighborhoods. From Messina, the contagion rode Mediterranean currents, west to Genoa and Marseille, east to Venetian and Dalmatian ports, and up river networks that stitched coastal cities to inland towns. Ports became transmission hubs not merely because ships brought infected animals and people, but because ports concentrated commerce, labor, and sheltering populations in confined, unsanitary spaces, where fleas and rats found easy opportunities. Within cities, the social and built environment amplified spread. Medieval urban quarters were dense and irregular, narrow lanes, timber-framed houses crowded against each other, and plumbing that was rudimentary at best. Open cesspits and streets where refuse accumulated created ideal conditions for commensal rodents. Markets thrummed with patrons, textile workshops packed workers side by side, and inns and river barges moved people across distances. When a disease that caused swollen lymph nodes, buboes fever, and a rapid decline arrived in such conditions, it did not need extraordinary force to cause rapid devastation. Medical understanding at the time offered scant protection. European physicians in the 14th century operated within the framework of Galenic medicine. Disease as imbalance of the humors, and contagion often attributed to miasma, poisonous airs arising from putrefying matter. Doctors prescribed bloodletting purgatives and aromatic compounds intended to cleanse the air. Some advised isolation and fumigation. These therapies were consistent with contemporary theory, but largely ineffective against a flea-borne bacterium. Other responses, like prohibitions on bathing, based on fear that exposing the skin would open the body to infection, were counterproductive by modern standards. In short, medical practice reflected the intellectual limits of the age. Witness accounts, where we have them, register shock and bewilderment. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence soon after the first wave, recorded the devastation with an economy that still chills. Men and women died each day in such numbers that it seemed the world must be brought to an end. That line, simple and direct, gives us a human scale for the statistical uncertainty historians must later wrestle with. The horror was immediate, personal, and transformative. The social consequences were swift. In towns, public life faltered, courts closed, markets shrank, guilds lost members, and municipal institutions struggled to function. Many wealthier families fled to country estates. The poor could not leave and often bore the brunt of the epidemic. Mass graves and communal pits replaced traditional burial rites in many places, practical measures born of necessity and fear. Where clergy remained, they often faced the impossible choice of ministering to the sick at great personal risk. Some church officials succumbed in droves. Religion shaped many of the human reactions. In the absence of effective medical answers, communities turned to prayer, penitential rites, and apocalyptic expectation. Flagellant movements, groups who publicly whipped themselves to atone for sin, swept across regions, drawing crowds and, tragically, spreading disease through their mass gatherings. Simultaneously, theologians and popes attempted to channel fear into pastoral guidance. Pope Clement VI, addressing the panic, issued statements that both condemned anti-Jewish violence and affirmed pastoral care for victims, urging clerics to remain at their posts. But official doctrine could not silence the more violent impulses overtaking many communities. Scapegoating emerged as one of the plague's most shameful legacies. Jews, already marginalized and often segregated into distinct quarters, became targets of accusation and fury. Rumors alleged poisoning of wells. Local tensions over debt and socioeconomic frictions found a lethal outlet in persecution. Pogroms erupted in some regions, with massacres and expulsions following in the plague's wake. Historians emphasize that these were not universal nor inevitable responses. Official condemnations existed, but they were tragically common enough to leave deep scars in medieval social memory. The spread was not uniform. Some rural areas experienced extreme depopulation, others saw more limited mortality. Rivers and roads functioned as vectors inland. Barges moved grain and people, and fairs, nodes for exchange, became nodes of contagion. Manorial systems anchored in labor tied to the land were tested as whole villages lost a significant portion of their workforces. Fields were left untended, harvests rotted, livestock suffered from neglect. In the immediate term, this was a crisis of subsistence. Over the longer term, the demographic shock produced economic consequences that would reshape medieval society. What were those consequences? Demography is perhaps the most consequential dark secret of the plague's aftermath, because the loss of life altered power dynamics and economic opportunity. While precise totals remain debated, modern estimates for Europe vary and scholars argue about methods and sources. Most agree that the demographic impact was dramatic. Many regions lost an estimated 1/3 or more of their populations. Some urban centers and rural districts experienced far higher losses. The contraction of available labor gave surviving peasants and craftsmen leverage. Wages rose in many places. Landowners struggled to maintain traditional obligations, and sometimes offered commutations of labor for money. Over decades, these pressures contributed to an erosion of serfdom in certain regions, and fostered social mobility for some survivors. These were not instantaneous inventions of liberty, but slow, uneven shifts in bargaining power and economic structure. Culturally, the plague left its mark. Art and literature across Europe began to fix on themes of mortality, judgment, and the dance between life and death. The danse macabre motifs, skeletons leading the living in a procession, captured a new public imagination where death seemed omnipresent. Liturgy and religious practice adapted, funeral rites were abbreviated where necessary, and memorialization practices shifted with the scale of loss. Among the more surprising legacies were early public health innovations. Faced with the reality that ships carried contagion, some Mediterranean cities experimented with isolation measures. The word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, and it was in port cities that enforced waiting periods and isolation stations for incoming ships first took hold. Venice, long a maritime power, developed institutions, lazarettos, on islands where suspected cases could be held and cargoes fumigated. These measures were imperfect and could not stop the first wave, but they represent an embryonic public health response. Policies aimed at slowing spread by controlling human and material movement. Similar ideas appeared in Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, and other port polities, and they would become a staple of epidemic management in subsequent centuries. Throughout this narrative of ecological displacement, commercial vectors, urban accelerants, and social reaction, one must remember an essential analytical caution. The past often comes to us filtered through rumor, panic, and selective survival of sources. Chroniclers wrote to make sense of catastrophe. They were not epidemiologists with microscopes and genomic sequencing. Where sources diverge, historians now use archaeology, demographic modeling, and bioarchaeology to test claims. DNA recovered from plague pits centuries later has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis in many medieval contexts, bolstering the case that bacterium was indeed a principal actor. But how it traveled from one region to another often rests on a mosaic of texts, ship logs, and ecological inference. We must therefore hold interpretation lightly and indicate where uncertainty remains. That methodological humility matters especially with episodes like Kaffa. The corpse-flinging image persists because it is a powerful, almost cinematic way to explain cross-cultural transmission, a single act of brutality, symbolically launching contagion into Europe. Yet even if that dramatic account is treated cautiously, Kaffa still signifies a nexus where military action, trade, and disease converged. It reminds us that human conflict can amplify epidemic risk through siege conditions, disrupted sanitation, and mass movement of people, without requiring intentional biological malfeasance. In short, whether corpses were truly hurled, or whether the story became amplified in retelling, the siege stands as a contested but important moment in the plague's story. Another dark aspect of the pandemic was the breakdown of trust and social order. Markets failed, contracts went unmet, and legal institutions strained under the absence of participants. In some towns, governments responded by attempting to fix wages, regulate labor, or impose harsh penalties to prevent flight. These measures often failed or provoked unrest. In the decades that followed, a pattern of rebellion and negotiation would mark the social landscape. The plague did not simply kill, it forced survivors and rulers to renegotiate what labor, obligation, and authority would mean in a changed world. Yet the story is not only one of collapse. The long-term transformations seeded in the 14th century helped prepare Europe for a slow, uneven transition to new forms of economy and culture. Labor shortages incentivized technological changes in agriculture, and the changing valuation of labor prompted legal and customary shifts. Intellectual life, where it survived, confronted mortality and sometimes questioned old certainties. In art, literature, law, and economy, the plague's shock rippled outward for generations. When we consider modern resonances, we should do so cautiously. There are echoes. A highly connected world amplifies localized biological events into global threats. Misinformation and fear can fuel scapegoating and violence, and public health measures, some basic, some blunt, become crucial tests of social cohesion. But the medieval world differed in governance, technology, and medical understanding. It is tempting to draw direct moral lessons. Better to recognize resonances. The Black Death teaches that interconnectedness is a double-edged sword, and that societal resilience depends on institutions, trust, and the ability to adapt quickly to biological threats. What, then, are the dark secrets we can reasonably reveal? First, the tragedy was not inevitable. It was produced by a chain of ecological disruptions, human movement, and social conditions that converted a zoonotic bacterium into a pandemic. Second, violent narratives, like the story of Kaffa, tell us as much about medieval meaning-making as they might about actual transmission. These stories shaped fear and behavior and deserve scrutiny. Third, human responses, medical, religious, and administrative, were shaped by the limits of contemporary knowledge and by social fractures. Some responses mitigated spread, many did not. Finally, the demographic shock opened pathways to profound economic and cultural change, demonstrating how catastrophe and adaptation can be bound together. There are still mysteries. Exact regional mortality figures will remain debated. The relative importance of different transmission routes in specific places will generate scholarly argument, and the social consequences varied widely by locality. But the arc is clear. From steppe rodents to port rats, from cramped alleys to mass graves, a chain of ecological and social links enabled a bacterium to alter the course of history. As we close, remember the human scale behind the numbers and maps. The baker who died unseen, the choir whose ranks thinned, the farmer who returned to an empty field. The past is lined with choices and constraints, with fear and courage. Understanding how the Black Death spread is not merely an exercise in curiosity. It is a study of how human systems, trade, warfare, religion, medicine, interact with the natural world in ways that can amplify catastrophe or contain it. For more detailed sources and further reading, check the description below for a bibliography and recommended books. If this investigation into history's darker mechanisms spoke to you, watch our deep dive on medieval medicine next. I'm Tim, watching the past so we can better understand the present.